Well, hello again, and now we're coming down to the latter parts of the research article structure. And it's really the old last but not least. So let's get to it. Uh, so in these videos, we're going to be looking at why the discussion section is one of the more challenging ones. Doesn't matter if your first language is English or not, it's a challenging section. And what is it supposed to do? And when I ask that question about what it's supposed to do, it makes me think about the first time I ever made a bowl of chili or made a batch of chili. Uh, this was a long time ago in the days before the internet where it wasn't easy to dig up a recipe. And basically I said, well, what does chili have in it? I think it's got some beans, it's got some meat, and basically I just kind of threw that together. I put in some meat and some beans, and basically it tasted awful. And I served it up to some guests, and I think they smiled politely, and I think they would rather have just forgotten that experience. The problem is I just didn't know what, at that time, I didn't know what went into chili. Of course, there's a lot more that goes into it, and there's a way of cooking it. And just like the bowl of chili that I made back then, if you don't know what goes into it, and you don't meet the expectations of the people you're serving it to, then you're just bound to disappoint. Um, in that case, I didn't get rejected as a friend, but in the case of an article, yeah, you got to be careful with the chili that you make. So you've seen this questionnaire before. This is the one that reviewers, similar to a lot of sort of little mini questionnaires that journals ask the reviewers to fill out before they come to a final judgment about whether they should accept or reject an article. And one of the uh, the important questions here is method, as we talked about earlier, and then this one here: the interpretations and conclusions, are they justified by the results? And it seems like such a simple question, but that's why you have to be very, very careful in the discussion section about building your case for why your research the results are interesting. Obviously, you're not making the case anymore for justifying your research to begin with. That's made up here and here. And now we're talking about, are your results, what do your results mean? And you need to know how to do that. Now, last week we looked at this commercial, which probably grossed a lot of people out. And we're going to look at this again briefly today in the context of how does the method connect with the results and then the discussion section. So this was the really bad. Imagine if this was a results section for this, which is just fiction here. Men were chosen for the experiment. After playing basketball, each man applied 2 different deodorants, one on each armpit. A young woman was recruited to judge how pleasing the smell of each deodorant was. The female judge smelled each armpit, each time noting her impressions. Her final analysis was then given based on the notes taken. And as you all noted, there were a lot of questions that could be raised with respect to this method, so many variables that could influence the outcomes. And some of the ones that come up in the discussion about what is missing here is, okay, is age a variable? Does the time spending smelling each armpit, was that controlled? Had them been showered prior to the experiment or with odorless soap? How about clothes? All these things that could possibly influence that could also possibly influence the results. And so, if in this fictional world of this deodorant experiment research report in the method section, if you did indeed control for those variables, you would want to include that information in the method section description. So you'd include something about the ages and the duration of the time played and what sort of deodorant was used, and then what criteria were used, and if it was validated, if they were validated before. So, the same criteria described in Smellers in 1993. If the variable of time was controlled for, which ideally it would. All this, of course, is not about the writing of the research. Now you're talking about, did you actually do that? So we're in this imaginary world of this method. We're assuming that you did a good job setting up your research design. You're just reporting that. And if in this imaginary research report, if I read this as a reviewer, this level of detail sends the message of, okay, this person did take care to write to design the research well, and is being very transparent in how they are coming to the results. Because if I don't understand how the results were arrived at, that's a problem. And so while this is a writing course, not a research design course, here you do have some overlap between those two things. And what happens is often um, a person spends so long thinking about a particular study. In the case of a PhD, for example, somebody spends years on that, and they just simply, omit information that's vital because that just seems so obvious to them because they spent so long thinking about it, and they just forget to put it in. So the method section, as you can see here, as we talked about in the module that discussed the method section, does tie back to the introduction often, as you would, um, all these variables here that you'd need to bring up in the introduction. Things like if age should be if age isn't a factor, or the type of deodorant, and so on, would need to go back and be included in the introduction. And so with this this fictitious method section, and oh yes, and as I mentioned in the other module, it's good if you have these kinds of statements to make it absolutely clear what each element of the research method is designed to do. So in this case, the judge smelling the armpit for 2 seconds and then signaling to the reader to control for intensity, and that would probably tie back to a variable that would be discussed in the territory that's established in the introduction. So in the introduction, you'd have maybe something like this. Again, this is just all fiction, but there has been an alarming decline in birth rates in the world, alarmist in 2017, so that's claiming centrality. One possible cause is a decline in deodorant use among men, Ridiculesky 2018. Much has been published on the effectiveness of deodorants, yet whether it is better to use a spray or roll-on type is still unknown. So here's your niche. It's this research. The research question is whether spray or roll-on is, and then you'd have all this discussion about the properties of those and what can influence their effectiveness and so on. So getting back to all these variables and all these possible confounds that were brought up in the discussion around the method, basically we're looking at how do all of those things possibly affect the results, because the results are obviously an artifact of the method section, and therefore anything that could possibly have influenced the results needs to be reported there in the method section, and um, and then any shortcoming, anything that should have or could have been but wasn't controlled for, then would need to go eventually in the discussion. So remember that this IMRaD is interconnected. You have introduction leading to method and connected to the results and connected to the discussion, the hip bone connected to the thigh bone and so on. And in a way to synopsize that is that the introduction is the why the research is important to begin with, method is how you did it, and results are what you did, and then discussion is the so what, and that's what we're talking about today. However, as I also mentioned, the why should permeate really everything. So it's not just how and why you did it that way, what and why it's those results, and the so what is is so what, and why do you think why do you come to those conclusions? And so all of those things are interconnected. The results section is connected back to the method section in the sense that the method obviously gives you your results, and then the effect, the effects that all of these variables could have on the results are need to be taken into account and need to be discussed here. And as you recall, one of the reasons for rejection that was found among the authors surveyed that I presented earlier in the course is a poor discussion. And so we're going to look at what a poor discussion means and what a good discussion means. And as we've already seen, a poor discussion is one that does not discuss the results in the light of all of the issues in the method and the introduction that were brought up before. So we're going to look at what a good discussion is too. You also have looked at a rejection. And this is something I hope you never see. Just to read it here quickly. In view of the criticisms of the reviewer found at the bottom of this letter, we cannot publish your manuscript in the Análise Academia Brasileira de Ciências. In the last year, we have received far more papers than we are able to publish and must make some tough decisions. All right, so that's obviously a gut punch. And then when you look at the reasons, you can see, if you read it, I'll read it quickly here. The manuscript is interesting and brings original ideas. However, a major revision is necessary. The methods should be described comprehensively and not confused as it is. Details such as water or not to process the mixtures are not mentioned, and this is an important point in this kind of product compositions, mainly due to lime and phase formation. There are not characteristics of the individual components, as the authors mentioned, that the materials are characterized. The results should justify the interpretations and conclusions. However, they are just pointed out and not discussed at all. Figures 2, 3, and 4 should be standardized to scale. Sometimes one of the components is namely referring to paper sludge. Sometimes it is namely ET, sludge, waste, and so on. Language should also be reviewed. Since the manuscript is concerning to technological development, it could present sample image, example, fracture surface image. Finally, very good revision is necessary. So, I mean, as we discussed earlier in this course, a lot of people will see this thing about language and think, okay, well, that's something I need to fix. But there's so much more that led to this rejection. And you can see that the methods are not very clearly described, and it's hard to understand, I imagine, how they got the results in a lot of cases. Important details are not mentioned, how they did what they did. And then you have this here. The results should justify the interpretations and conclusions, but they're just pointed out and not discussed at all. So what you have here is a sad rainbow of sadness of things that caused the article to be rejected. It's not just one thing. The language thing probably just tipped the scales, or really what the main thing was the research itself. They couldn't understand how they got to what they got to, and then and this thing in sort of pink here, that the results are just pointed out and not discussed at all, is indeed one of the more common problems that I see in manuscripts. But really, I don't fault the researchers so much. It's that they just really, in many cases, have just never learned what is expected of them for that, how to make that bowl of chili. So this is a difficult section to write. That chili can be tricky for a lot of people, and it's not just for non-native speakers, but you can imagine that for non-native speakers, where they may be writing in a language that's not their own, it's even particularly more difficult. And this was something that was first investigated, or at least to my knowledge, one of the first people to investigate this was John Flowerdew back in 1999, investigating in the context of Hong Kong, what problems these scholars had for publishing in English. And you know, in the context of Hong Kong, these are people who grow up with English, but it's still not their first language in many cases. And so, in John Flowerdeau's research, he looked at categories of problems, and there are a number of things. You know, it's harder for them to express themselves. They take longer to write. Their vocabulary is not as rich. And then one of them is the introductions and discussions are the most problematic parts of research articles for non-native speakers to write. And so I asked what makes the discussion section so challenging, and what should a discussion section do to really kind of instigate or kind of force a little bit that reflection, because so few people think about it and wonder what goes into it, and how one can set up a discussion section that it does not just do what the rejection letter said, which was just to recap the results in that example I showed you just a second ago. And if you reflect on that, then you see that that is what answers that first question, is why the discussion section is so challenging. It's just because people do not know what goes into it to a large degree. But another reason is simply that if you are an early researcher with not so much experience, and especially if you're working on your dissertation or your thesis and you have so much invested in it, it's hard to look at your own research critically. And I mean, that's not to say that people don't criticize themselves a lot when they're in the research process as a grad student. They do criticize themselves a lot. But what I mean is looking at their own research as possibly not being perfect. And so that can be tricky. So what John Flowerdeau reports is that that according to these authors, the easiest part is the methodology and the results. And as we've seen, it's not even that simple, but at least there they just simply can report what they did. And it's very factual, and they just have to do, you know, reportage. But the difficult parts are the introduction, which we've covered a lot, and the discussion and conclusions. And these parts are more problematic because they require a persuasive style of writing in which the individual voice of the author needs to come through. Writers have to convince their readers, including editors and reviewers, in these two sections of the importance of their research and the arguments they are putting forward. And all this sounds nice, and it's all true, but to somebody who's never thought about this before, has thought about writing, is only focused on their research, it can be all just sort of gobbledygook, because you know, a concept as vague and as complex as voice, authorial voice, is something that people don't really talk about or think about and are able to operationalize. We have, to some degree in this course, so you have an idea of that. And then also convincing the reader and persuading the reader. Okay, those are big words, but how do you do that? So that's what we're going to look at next in the next video, is what are the specific ingredients, and there are a few that can help you. There's a way that you can make a pretty yummy chili.